All right, let's be turning our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 this morning. Now, last week we handed out a new sheet of paper, but we said it was sort of conditional. We said we're actually going to take the current lesson and split it into two different lessons. So that's what we're doing this morning. We're finishing up the lesson we started last week in Matthew chapter 5, and then the paper we handed out last week for Matthew 6, verses 1 through 18. We'll take a look at that next week together. That's on Jesus and performance worship, performance religion. And you may be looking ahead. That's where you have the example of almsgiving, and you have the example of fasting, and the example of prayer. And you essentially have three illustrations of the same truth. That's why I think we'll make it through that section in just one pass through. Maybe if we have to divide that up, we can do that when we get to it. But I'm thinking might be able to get through it in one session. This one was a little different though, because we have two related subject matters, beginning in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. About going the second mile, giving your coat if necessary, turning the other cheek. We talked about those last week. But we wanted to really spend some time today on verse 43 through verse 48. And we are following the discussion questions that appear on lesson number 8 about Jesus and enemies. And the first part last week was question number 1, which is, what do you think Jesus means when he speaks of turning the other cheek? Is he saying that we should submit ourselves to physical abuse? And so we spent a good deal of time talking about that last week. So we're going to spend the rest of today talking about question 2, 3, and 4, which gets us through verse 43 to the end of the chapter. So let's read it and let's go back and we'll discuss it. Beginning in verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So we have 3 discussion questions that relate to this section, and we're just going to take it beginning with the first one. So here's the first of the discussion questions, and that's this. Why do you think that the Pharisees taught people to hate their enemies? And then a follow-up to that would be, what is our typical response to being wronged? And then what is his point about God blessing the just and the unjust? Okay? So let's begin with that first part. Because when Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, he says, you heard people say, right, this is part of their teaching tradition. You've heard people say, love your neighbor, but you've also heard people say, hate your enemy. So why do you think they were teaching people to hate their enemy? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Art. Okay. Right? Oh, sure. Yeah, the contradictory things, love your neighbor, but then turn around and hate somebody. But I think there may have been some personal benefit in that, for sure, based on what they were doing and sort of preserving themselves. So it certainly benefited them in that. Ken? Yeah. Sure. Some misconceptions about how God wanted those people treated. And I think that's certainly a part of it. And I think we'll swing back to that in just a minute. Any other thoughts on that? We're gonna dig into that first part. Well, the first thing we notice in looking at this, when he says, you've heard that it was said, does that tell us that we're still in the illustrations, he started way back in verse 20, 21. Remember, he said, let your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, and then he started using illustrations. You've heard that it was said, don't commit murder, but I say. You've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery, but I say. You've heard that it was said, don't swear, and then, but I say. And so he has all these illustrations, and this is another illustration of the same thing. So we know he's dealing with abuse because all these illustrations they are demonstrating abuse among the religious leaders. So we have an illustration about mistreatment. That started back in verse 38. Now, here's the part that is indisputable, right? It's amazing how they sort of mix this in with something that was beyond question. The one thing that was never questioned was the law's teaching on love your neighbor. And did the law teach that? Did it teach to love your neighbor? It was very clear. In fact, what he says here is just a direct quote of an Old Testament passage. If you want to hold your place and go back to Leviticus chapter 19, we'll just see the very same language in Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19. Now, he doesn't reference the entire passage, but he verbatim quotes in his illustration of how the law was being abused. He references this part of the law, verse 18. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So he's directly quoting Leviticus 19:18. And for that part, it was very indisputable. But somehow, that had been reinterpreted with an addition to mean love your neighbor, but hate your enemies. And that's how that had been reinterpreted in the teaching of the Pharisees. And the interesting thing was, it was being taught to hate your enemies as if God had said it. And, because he said, you've heard that it's been said, and they were making an appeal to the law and somehow adding that on. And so the question is, where did it originate from? And I think what Art said is true. Some of that was sort of a self-sustaining practice where they were sort of, holding on to some practices, and if people didn't agree, they just rubbed them out based on this love your enemy, love your neighbor, hate your enemy thing. But some of it goes to what Ken was saying too, and I think there had been some misunderstanding based on some ancient practices. And I think Ken raised a good point about some of the conditions of the conquest, that somehow they had interpreted that to mean, if you're in opposition to somebody, then you also hate that person as well. And I think they had misinterpreted some of the punitive actions that God had against unholy people in the Old Testament. So go back and look at, let's look at a few passages. Go back to Exodus chapter 23. Yes, sir. Oh, they just hated him. Yeah. Oh, sure. And they justified it. They thought they were right. Paul even said, I did it in all good conscience. So they justified that loathing of Jesus. I think that's a very good point. So let's go back to Exodus 23. But look beginning in verse 20. Look beginning in verse 20. Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. But if you indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to all your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. And if you had a long-standing practice of going against enemies, and if you had some sort of warped worldview or warped theology, well, you may interpret language like that to mean you ought to hate those people that you're going against. And I think I think that's what Ken was talking about, that they had gone against so many people in the Old Testament that maybe some of that had been interpreted into we ought to hate those people that we're going against. We have a lot of references to the same thing. If we go up a few more chapters to Exodus 34, we're not going to read that, but Exodus 34 verses 11 to 16, God said, you drive them out of the land. You drive them out, a complete conquest out of the land of Canaan. In Numbers 31, you see a chapter that records war against the Midianites. How about Deuteronomy 7? In Deuteronomy 7, what did God say about marriages to the people in Canaan? You remember? What did he say they were to do in relation to marriages with the Canaanites? Don't have them. And he said, they'll turn your heart away from me. Don't do that. Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 through 6. Deuteronomy chapter 23, in the first about 6 verses, you see how they were to mark the Ammonites and the Midianites and the Moabites as enemies. And then look at Jonah's attitude, right? Jonah gets commissioned to go preach to the people of Assyria, and what's his attitude toward Nineveh? I'm not doing it. He didn't like them. And the book even ends, even after he's preached, with him still hoping that God would destroy those people. They didn't like them at all. And so I think some of that had to do with a misinterpretation of those punitive actions against unholy people in the Old Testament. But here's the question. Anytime God took action against an unholy people in the Old Testament, is it because he hated those people? It's because he loved Israel, right? And so that's the part B that they had forgotten. Those punitive actions never dissolved the principles of fair treatment and kindness. And even when they went against those nations, there was still mercy that they were supposed to offer. And there's still some principles of justice and mercy and faith that they should have offered in those situations. And I think you see that. In Leviticus 19, where we just read, if we keep on reading, he talks about how that there's still mercy towards strangers and foreigners and things of that sort. And there's just too many passages in the Old Testament. Even still, go back to Matthew chapter 5. Whatever their reason was for saying that, right? Would hate your enemies. We know what heaven's position on that is, because in verse 44, when they say hate your enemies, Jesus says, but I say to you, and what's heaven's position? This has always been heaven's position. What's the position of God? Love your enemies, okay? So it's always been the case. So we know that not only is he setting the law straight, right? Not that anything was flawed in the law, he's setting straight what they believed about the law. But it's also telling us that was the true intention of the law. Even though they were supposed to have actions against certain people, you're still supposed to love those people. And Jesus is telling us that we ought to love our enemies. Now here's something that I'm sure you looked it up, but I think it's important to this. It's the word love here. And the word love is the word agape. What's that tell us? What do you know about agape love? Okay, so it's love that's patterned after the love of God. So it's the closest to being what we would enact of being patterned after the love of God himself. What else do we know about agape love? In order of the strength of love, which love is the strongest love? Agape love is. It's the strongest. It's a very sacrificial love, and agape love is sort of a decision, right? It's not based on circumstances. It's a decision that one makes, and it doesn't change regardless of the circumstances. And it's sacrificial. It always does what is in the best interest of someone else. So here he's telling them that instead of hating your enemies, now you ought to have the highest form of love toward the people that you would identify as an enemy. You ought to have a decided sacrificial love that always does what's in the best interest even of your enemies. So that means that he is requiring of us the very opposite of hate. Agape love is the very opposite of that. Plus, we're required to understand enmity different than the world would understand that, right? When God identifies something or someone as an enemy, the standard for that is very different than the world's standard for enemy. Because in this world, what does it take to be an enemy of somebody? Not a whole lot, right? I mean, you just look at somebody the wrong way and you can become an enemy of somebody. And we have enemies for a lot of different reasons. We have political enemies. We have social enemies, business enemies, personal enemies for all kinds of reasons. But in the Bible, enmity is defined differently with God. How does God view enmity? How would he do that? What is it? Yeah, it's based on sin. It's based on our real adversary is who? Who's our real adversary? All right, the devil is, because he's the adversary of God and man. And people who serve him are enemies based on their service or allegiance to the devil. Look at James chapter 4. This is a great passage. This is how God defines being an enemy. James chapter 4. So James chapter 4. And let's take a look at verse 4. Now this is after James has strongly rebuked the readers because they're fighting amongst each other, and he's not having it. By inspiration, he's not having it. And finally he says, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Now that's what enmity is according to God. And there's other passages that maybe we could throw along with that, but the idea is that to be a real true enemy of God, it's to sort of have your allegiance with Satan, and it's only for that reason. But even still, if someone is identified as an enemy, even based on that, what's our response? We don't approve of what they're doing, but what's our attitude? Yeah, we love that person, right? We love the person, even though we might disagree with their position because we think enmity with the world makes you an enemy of God, or friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God. We still love the person who's caught in that. And when we agape love even our enemies, then it brings in all the principles that God wants us to have toward people. Restraint, discipline, even to the point of punishment or protection. All of that is aimed at helping a person, not hurting a person. And that's what God is. And I think this goes back to what Art said at the very beginning, because there was an effort on the part of Pharisees in the first century that if you crossed them, they never tried to help you. They tried to hurt you is what they did. They ended up hurting, like Tommy was saying, they ended up going after Jesus because he stood in their way. And so instead of trying to convert him to their practices, they just hurt him, and that's what they did. And so the Lord said, what I want you to do is when you find an enemy, help him, don't hurt him. So that brings up the second part of our question is, when we conceive somebody to be an enemy of ours, what is the, and it doesn't have to be just here at North Hamilton, but I mean just general public response to people who cross one another. What is the general attitude toward people that cross us? How do we typically respond to somebody that we would consider now an enemy? Is it very kind? Yeah, I mean, and some more than others. There's some brutal people in the world who, if you cross them, they're going to come at you with all that they've got because they want their pound of flesh. And the Lord is saying that's not what we do. Right? We talked about that last week about the turning of the other cheek. There's a system that God has in place on earth to deal with matters like that. But our response is not trying to hurt people. It's trying to help people. And that's not in keeping with love when we're after the very worst for a person, because true love seeks the very best in a person. And even though a person is an enemy, what should be our ultimate goal for a person that would even be our enemy? What do we really want for that person? Yeah, we want them to go to heaven. That's tough, right? Because in the back of our mind, we may be seething and we may say, I want that person. We're going to get what they deserve. But that shouldn't be our attitude. We're trying to help those people go to heaven, even our enemies. So Jesus, what he does, he illustrates for us what that ought to look like. And he illustrates it going back to Matthew chapter 5. Here is his illustration of what it looks like to love your enemies. So he says, I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. So he gives us illustrations of what that looks like when we're truly trying to love our enemies. We're blessing people that curse you. Boy, that's tough. Yes, David? Right. Well, this is not a situation that applies in a civic sense, right? In a national sense. This is a passage that talks about, like we said last week, like personal wrongs, personal injuries against you. This is not a situation where your life is being threatened. And we said there's This is not the turn the other cheek, and this is not a situation that would apply when someone's trying to murder your family or kill you. That's a different situation entirely. There are other Bible principles that relate to those things. This is somebody says something bad against you, or you're at the workplace and there's just a thorn in your flesh and they're always trying to ruin you. There's a way of approaching that situation versus trying to hurt them back. But there's two totally different situations. Yeah, no. Last week we talked about that, how Jesus is not addressing physical injury or abuse. You don't subject yourself to that. In fact, the Bible advocates for protecting yourself. We have to protect ourselves. Yeah, so we're just dealing with personal slights at this point, And we've all in every profession, you run into people who set themselves up in opposition to you, right? They're not a physical threat, but they're a tremendous stress on the mind, right? They hurt your feelings. Emotionally, it's hard to bear with. And Jesus is saying, instead of trying to hurt them back, you try to help those people. You're helping those people get to heaven. So here's his illustration, right? Bless those who curse you. That's a tough thing, isn't it? Someone says something bad against you, because the first thing you want to do back is what? Let them have it. I mean, it's easy to not practice restraint and just let the words fly, and some people can, I'm telling you, there are people who can be absolutely flat out mean in what they say. And Jesus says when they let it rip with their mouth, you bless them back, right? The way you treat them back ought to be different. And do good to those who hate you, right? So if you have somebody who just loathes you, can't even stand your presence, you do good to those people. And you pray for those that persecute and abuse you. And that's super hard at times. I think it's really, really hard. But true love produces a different kind of fruit that helps us to deal with that, right? Because true love involves justice and mercy and meekness and freedom of choice and purity and patience and truth. All that's wrapped up in true love. Now, here's another illustration of the same thing. Another illustration of the same thing. Down in verse 45, he illustrates it because he's going to show us, and this gets back to what Dad was talking about just a moment ago, about if you have agape love mimics the love of God. Okay? So he's going to illustrate, here's how God treats even enemies. Verse 45, that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven. Now, in order to do that, when he says that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven, that's in order that you may be. And that goes back to the previous section, right? You love your enemies so that you can be like God. Here's what God does. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. And he sends rain on the just and on the unjust. So he offers this illustration about our Father's benevolence. And so he gives the illustration of the sunshine. The sun shines on the just and on the unjust. Now, it's more than just, when you have sun and rain, it's more than just sometimes rain falls and people get wet. And sometimes there's, the sun is out and people can enjoy the sun. There's probably a real practical benefit of that, because you put yourself in an agricultural setting, and what do people need for their crops to grow? You got to have both. You got to have sun and rain. And so the Lord provides even for the crops of evil men to grow. That's pretty benevolent. And he does the same thing for the good. So the question is, well, why does he do that? Why does God do that? Because he loves people, right? He doesn't wish the worst for people, and he's not compromising by doing that, right? It's not a compromise to try to treat people better than they've treated you, but his benevolence is aimed at helping people, and ultimately, if he helps someone in his general, sort of generic providence, he provides sunshine and rain, for example, and their crops can grow even though they spit on him every day by the way that they act and think and live. They're just vile people. But eventually, by providing the sun and the rain, what's the possibility in that provision? Someday, maybe, what might they do? They might appreciate what he's done for them, and they may turn to him. And that's the benefit of acting the right way. And so his benevolence is aimed at helping all people to seek him. And there's a couple passages I just jotted down. Look at Acts chapter 14. Let's go up to Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14. So Paul is preaching a message, and he's preaching to lost people. These are people that needed to be able to find God. And as a part of that message, what's interesting, he uses as an illustration, Paul and Barnabas doing this speaking here in verse 17, speaking of God, he says, "Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness." So all these benefits that God provides, even to the worst of people upon the earth, are aimed at someday helping those very people who revile him at this point of turning their hearts to him. God's actually been better to me than I deserve to be treated. I'm going to serve him. And that's what he hopes. And if God can do that for the people who aren't good, right, for the just and the unjust, if he can still do it to the unjust, then as much as it may pain me to do it, and much as I may want to do otherwise, then I need to treat my enemies better than they deserve to be treated, because that's how God treats us as well. Okay? Any thoughts on that? We've got another question coming up. Question number 3 coming up. Okay, let's go back to Matthew 5. Here's question number 3. This is discussion question number 3. I think this is an interestingly worded section here. Verse 46 and 47 about loving those who love you, what reward have you? So question number 3 is, why do you think he warns us not to love those that love you? And what does he mean by that? Did you look at those verses? It's a very interesting way of saying this, but what does he mean by don't just love the people who love you, but love others too? What does he mean by all of that? Okay, so it goes to, prejudice to respect a person. I think that's certainly involved in this. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, Art? Sure, yeah. Yeah, it for sure is. And it's still based on that, that prejudice principle, but it's very easy to get along with people who already get along with you. It's much harder to get along with somebody who's not in that circle. Don, you had your hand up. Yeah. There you go. A great example of that. So you've got the parable of the Good Samaritan, and you've got some folks who sort of illustrate this. You got the priest and the Levite who probably did this very thing. They associated with people who associated back with them, but didn't really go outside that circle very much. Ken? Yeah, I think so. All these illustrations are bringing back our attention to the way that God interacts with people, the way he blesses people, even if they're not quite fond of him. So, but I think this is very challenging language. I think this is a challenge to the way that we approach other people. If we demonstrate our love only to people who reciprocate it back, how does that make us any different from the people that he's rebuking when he says, you've heard them teach, hate your enemies? It doesn't make us any better if we're simply loving people that love us back, right? But how does it make us any different than the sinners that do the same thing? Or he follows it up by simply saying, if you're courteous only to the people who are already courteous to you, how are we any better than people in the world? And I think there's a real challenge there, personally. And I think as a congregation that we have to be sure that we certainly can't endorse wrong, but we have to make sure that our treatment of people is fair across the board, right? We're treating everybody the same way, regardless of whether they're reciprocating back the way that we treat them. And this all goes back to agape love, right? Because he says, verse 46, if you love those that love you, that's agape love. And his point is that's not how agape love works, because agape love by nature has no boundaries placed upon it. It's not limited just to certain people. It has to be equally extended to everybody, because that's what God does with his love. He extends it to everybody. And true love is concerned for everybody, not just for people who reciprocate back all the good things you do for them, because that's a pretty cushy lifestyle, right, where you're only involved in people who treat you back the same way that you treat them, because there's no challenge in that. It's very convenient to do that. It's much more difficult to expand that love and let it go beyond to people who don't show it back. We can't be godlike until we act like God. That's his point in verse 44. And even when someone is a spiritual enemy, True love prohibits us from acting ugly toward that person and retaliating against that person. And back to what Tommy was saying earlier, I mean, you want a great illustration of what Jesus was trying to expose in the way they treated him is exactly what he was trying to expose. They didn't listen, but even still, Jesus was exposing that. Any thoughts on that? I think that's a challenging passage about you can't just be kind to the people who are kind back to you. You have to be kind to everybody, even if they're not kind back to you. All right, so here's the last thing. This, to me, is another challenging part of this text. But if you keep it in context, right, keep it in context, it's not so hard. And the last part is, number 4, how would you explain Jesus' charge to be perfect? How do we understand that? Because I've heard plenty of people say, I'm not perfect. You can't be perfect. And yet in this passage, what is Jesus telling us? You better be perfect. So how do we make that jive? What are we talking about here? Any thoughts? I know you'd like to speak, Joe. You just don't have a voice. I know you can't do it. I can see him wanting to do it. Okay, and that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yes. Right. That's it. That's the key to that passage. Does the word perfect here mean sinless? No. That's how people think it. You know, we sometimes when we conceive the idea of perfection, we mean flawless perfection. The Lord is not saying, unless you are flawlessly perfect like your God the Father in heaven, then that's it. You haven't made it. That's not what he's suggesting here, because it fits a context. In fact, the very first word of verse 48 is what? Therefore, this is a conclusion based on everything that he's been saying. And Art, you had your hand up. I don't know, did you have something different than Tommy? Same thing? Yeah, is it? Sure. That's right. That's right. Yeah, so there's two things that really help to explain this. One is the context, right? We've not broken the conversation. We're still in the middle of treat your enemies better than they deserve to be treated, and he keeps showing us God. Now, God makes the rain shine on He makes it fall on the just and on the unjust. He makes the sun shine on the just and on the unjust. Therefore, be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, the whole passage is not about sinlessness. It's about the way we treat enemies. It's about the way that we respond to people who've mistreated us. So the context is telling us when he says be perfect because God is perfect, it's saying be like God. If God treats enemies better than they deserve to be treated, then you have to do exactly the same thing. And the second part of it would be what Tommy was saying. The word perfect here does not mean sinless. It means mature. Some translations might have that sense. It means to be full grown or to be complete. To be complete. And in the Greek, when they use the word perfect that's used here, it meant act in such a way as to achieve the goal. And I think that's the idea here. That we are supposed to act in such a way that makes us like our Father in heaven. And that's what's meant by perfection in this passage. And so if we ration our love, right, we only give a little bit of our love away only to the people who reciprocate it back, right? We save it because we're only going to give it to people that we know are going to reciprocate the same thing. That's not real love. So if we ration our love or prevent it toward a certain people, it's an incomplete love, and it's not like our Father's love in heaven. I want to end on this passage. Would you turn your Bible to Romans 5? I think this is just a great companion passage. Romans chapter 5. And we want to pay attention to the language, especially when we get down toward about verse 10. Let's start in verse 6. And notice how Paul, he uses the pronouns to put us in the passage. And anytime we read it, we ought to do that. When he says we, and I'm right there with him. So in verse 6, when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. And when Paul says, when we were without strength and Christ died for the ungodly, who's he calling the ungodly here? It's us. We are the ungodly, and Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man some would even dare to die. But God demonstrates His own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, now He's called us ungodly, and He's called us now sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than having now been justified by His blood, we shall be saved from wrath through Him. Now remember, our typical reaction toward enemies is, you get your pound of flesh out. You take it back on them. And He's told us, you don't hate your enemies, you love them. You always do what's in their best interest. And then in verse 10 He says, for if when we were, and here's the word. What's the word? We're enemies. We're God's enemies. We were reconciled to God through the death of His Son. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. We were enemies. And yet how did God treat us? Much better than we deserve to be treated. Yeah, Philip? Definitely. Yes. Yeah. And has to be taught. No. It's a work. It's definitely work. Yeah, it is. It's definitely work. And so to be perfect, it requires some trial and error to get there. But yeah, we're not inherently just going to get it overnight instantaneously. It requires some effort to get there, that's for sure. But I think this passage perfectly illustrates that if ever there was an illustration to say, okay, let's be like God because He treats enemies better than we deserve to be treated, Paul said, well, put yourself there because you are an enemy of God. And yet He gave His Son to die for you. So, very good. Thank you so much. We'll put a peg in it here. Take a look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 18. 3 illustrations of performance religion, and Jesus says something about it. So we've got some discussion questions. If you didn't get a copy of that, I put a few extra copies on the back table. But thank you for your great input today. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.